It should go without saying at the beginning of this video, I am not a lawyer. I haven't studied law, but I have spoken to some lawyers and some law students on this particular topic. Now, contracts in esports have essentially always had a power dynamic where they were used by teams to have power over the player. And that meant players sometimes in the past didn't get paid, or their pay was delayed, despite the fact the contract might have stated you have to be paid within 30 days of shipping an invoice or whatever it might be. All these different factors that go into existence. Well, why do you think it is that now big organizations, teams we're talking about here, actively beg for arbitrary punishment from game developers, for example, like Riot Games in the LCS, for example, or in games which, like in other games which don't have such direct developer support, like in Dota 2, for example, CSGO. Orgs in those games want governing bodies set up that can punish players, and they want associations that can force the power of teams and organizations and leagues together to make the player comply with them. Why do you think they want this now? Because they themselves are in a situation where it's them that can't enforce the contract. They never should have actually been able to in some respects anyway, but part of the reason they can't enforce the terms of these contracts is because it's very, very unlikely that anyone's actually going to court over these contracts. Some of these contracts we're talking about, if you went to court, think about if a player, so in LCS terms, for example, if you don't have Riot to punish you for not upholding your end of the contract, if you had to legally process the contract and the details of it and the claim, then let's say it happened in the end of the spring split of this year. Now, you want to take this player to court, you say the way he left wasn't right, or I had him under term of contract where he should have stayed a bit longer, then you try to take him to court. What if it takes you 2 years to get that through court? Now, in that point in time, you might have had 5 splits of play that went on. You might have had a whole World Championship campaign. You might have had other players in that you concentrated on. Odds are, in this scenario, you're going to go, it's too long. It's going to be too long to process it. It's too much money at risk. Maybe I have to put in hundreds of thousands of dollars over this period of time to keep the court case going, get all the evidence, pay all the lawyers. And maybe after those 2 years, it's not relevant anymore. You've had all these other teams. By that point in time, that team's a long distant memory. That player being in your team might not even matter anymore. You might have a better team now. You might have accomplished different things. You might not even be in League of Legends anymore. You're not going to care as much anymore. That's why they go with the arbitrary route of having like a Riot who within the game can punish you because you want to play in LCS. Or in another scenario, maybe they want you to be punished so you can't play in majors in Dota 2 or CSGO. So it's a way to enforce rules outside of the legal context. There's also the problem for orgs that a lot of these contracts aren't tailored or aren't specific enough to the exact things that they want. A lot of people actually are still using contracts that they did not have designed by a lawyer. They did not have written up very specific to every single demand they want. They're using a lot of boilerplate material that they've just downloaded off the internet. That's a very standard contract, thinking, well, none of this is ever going to actually be enforced. So I'll just get these as general terms that we all agree to, and hopefully the player thinks this is like a life and death this contract and just does everything I want. I've had this happen myself, where I've had contracts sent to me where some of the clauses I've looked through and had lawyer friends look at them, and they've gone, this is a ridiculous clause, like, don't accept this. And when I contact the company, I say, actually, I'm not going to accept that, I want it reworded. They go, oh yeah, no problem with that. Which means that actually, in a lot of cases, they didn't know themselves. It was just something that was in a contract that maybe is a holdover from what that contract might be like in some commercial aspect of business that has nothing to do with them, but they just downloaded it. Now, the reason I'm making the point of this video, and the reason why this video is called Disobey This Contract, is too many times in the past, I've seen players get fucked over big time by their contract, when if you actually looked at the contract and you took it to someone with legal expertise, they'd go, you know what, this contract would never hold up. It would never hold up in California. It would never hold up in Germany. It would never hold up in these different places. So actually, you're not actually obliged to hold up your end of the contract if they're using some unfair enforcement of a clause that never should have been allowed to exist in the contract. So in the past, a good example is when Forgiven left Copenhagen Wolves. Remember, he was initially going to go and join Ninjas in Pyjamas, but they chose not to get him. So because Ninjas in Pyjamas didn't come on, didn't buy him out, didn't make any sort of agreement, Forgiven actually did not play for anyone in the summer split of 2014 because he was so naive. He thought, because in his contract, he was under contract for a year with Copenhagen Wolves, that he was then required to sit around and do nothing unless he was either playing for Copenhagen Wolves, which he didn't want to do, or someone bought him out of his contract. What he didn't realize was, if they aren't paying you salary on that, if they aren't giving you anything in return, it doesn't matter if the contract's for 1 year. You are not required to just sit around doing nothing for a year of your life, for 6 months. So a similar scenario happened. One of the times when I actually was able to speak to people with legal expertise, and I got some knowledge of this area and why it's problematic was when Shifter and Zion Spartan, the mid laner and top laner, at the time of Coast, if you remember, they were in the spring split of 2014, and then the team got relegated at the end of the split. And when they got relegated, these two players were still under contract for the rest of the year. And it turned out that teams came and they wanted to buy these players. They wanted to go and they wanted to purchase them. They were willing to spend big money, but the buyouts are incredibly large. If you remember, they did end up getting bought out. They ended up getting bought out by Dignitas, and they went and joined Team Dignitas. Now, interestingly, I knew some other teams who were talking to them at the time. And what's amazing is that on one hand, the buyouts were very large, especially for that time, and the players in theory had to be bought out, we were being told. Yet what's very interesting is that actually, since they were relegated, there was a clause in the contract, I'm told, that said that they were not going to get any salary if they were relegated. So think about this. They were relegated from the LCS, therefore they don't get any salary, yet the person expects them to stay with the team for 6 months unless they are bought out. So what he's essentially saying is, since you signed this contract, for the next 6 months, or rather the next split of play, if we're being honest, next 3 months, you don't have to receive any money to live off, and yet I still get all the other terms of the contract. You still are beholden to me. You can't go anywhere else unless I sell you, and you just have to sit on the bench or play for my team. One of the two, and play maybe without salary in Challenger. Now, the reason why someone contacted me, and I spoke to a few people about this topic, and again, I don't know all the legal terms, but essentially it was explained to me that this would not hold up, particularly in California, but it wouldn't hold up in many places in the world as a contract. Because think about it, there's a concept in contracts of like due compensation, which is the idea that when you do something and you give up a right, or you waive a right, or you give someone else a right over you, you have to be compensated for that in some way. So the compensation that these players received previously for being players in Coast and playing for the LCS team and not just leaving and going anywhere else was their salary and obviously a spot in the LCS. When they don't have that, when they don't have any money and they're getting, essentially, you think about it, they're getting nothing from Coast in this scenario, they are no longer obliged to uphold the rest of that contract. Coast is the same reason why I can't just make a contract now and say, similar scenario, okay, I'm going to pay you $400 a week to work for me, and if for some reason the business goes badly, I don't have to pay you anymore for any other weeks, but you're required to remain and work sort of like a slave for the next 50 years. Now, if we sign this contract, we can both sign it, and I can think that this contract's legal, but if we then go to court, or rather you just disobey it, it's going to be very hard for me to actually get anyone who will say that you're forced to remain in this contract. You have to work for the next 10 years as a slave for me with no compensation, with no money. It likely would immediately be a void contract, would be considered like against, I don't know all the terminology, like against the spirit of the contract. It wouldn't be considered legal. There's all these points to be made there. So there has to be compensation. So I want players in these scenarios to think about the compensation and whether that's reasonable for what they're giving up in these circumstances, because otherwise players are going to get abused like this. There's also the fact that some of these buyouts, I suspect, would not actually hold up in a court of law. Like, it's one thing if you set the buyout at a reasonable rate, but I've seen buyouts which compared to market value were way too high, which compared to the salary that the player was getting were way too high, and compared to the value of the player, even to the org, were way too high. So I heard a story of a CSGO player's contract that his buyout was set at, first of all, there was no buyout set. I don't know if that would even count, if that would hold up. But then his owner set his buyout at 1 million euros. Now, I hope it goes without saying that there are entire teams who are going to accomplish a lot more for you than this player who would be sold for less than $1 million. This is a ridiculously high amount. And as a result, I don't think the judge would actually allow that as their buyout set. I don't think that would be considered a reasonable amount. It's not the case that people think that if you signed a contract, you have to do everything that you say in it, and whatever they say in the contract is now agreed upon, therefore it's legal. No, because signing a contract does not make something legal. The contract has to adhere to the law of the area that it is signed in. And so a lot of these contracts have details in them that are very shaky, and then if ever tested would not be upheld. Now, the point here is, as I said in the first issue about the orgs, most of these contracts are never going to court. They're never going to. So aside from people like Riot who can punish you within the game if they decide to, or an association who might be able to punish you, if you're the player and it's an unfair scenario, don't even worry about court. It's not going to court very likely. You can just say, I'm not going to uphold this aspect. Go get some legal help, hopefully. And in that scenario, you're just freed at that point in time. They set the unreasonable terms. You're now free to go and do whatever you want and sign a contract with someone else. So if you're a pro player, don't think that you have to obey everything in the contract. That's not how it works. First things first, seek legal advice. I mean, even if it's professional advice, Some of the people will give you professional advice for $100 an hour, $300 an hour. If you're talking about just getting 2 or 3 hours worth of them looking over a simple contract, giving you details, you might have a $100K contract. That's worth the $200 to $300, mate, to know where you stand and if you can get out of the $100K contract. Worst case scenario, at least speak to, ask one of your fans if they're a law student and get some very basic info so they can either look at it and give you some basic knowledge, or they can say, point you in the direction of, right, get this part checked out by our lawyer. Orgs use contracts against you, but you can use the system against them in the fact that we're not at the level yet where your contract's $5 million and they're going to take you to court for 3 years and they're going to risk everything and $500,000 worth of legal fees, knowing that if they win and have a likely case, they'll win the court fees back and they'll get you instated to their team. Remember, we're not signing 5-year contracts for players to play for one team here. Most of these contracts are for a year or for a split. So in the spirit of this, players and pros need to have a heads up on this, and they need to look at the fact that the reason why the esports landscape is changing so that orgs are trying to put in place level of abstraction between the law and you so that you get punished within this little world of esports and this little league is because they can't enforce them. So don't allow unfair contracts to be used against you or other pros.